Good morning, students. Today we will discuss the last part of the play The Mother's Day by J.B. Priestley. As I have already told you in the class, that what happened when the real Mrs. Annie Pearson returned in the body of Mrs. Fitzgerald. The real Mrs. Pearson shows concern for her family. After a huge fight between the actual Mrs. Fitzgerald and George Pearson, the real Mrs. Pearson tries to calm everyone, but the real Mrs. Fitzgerald stood up against the rude behavior of George Pearson and threatens him to slap his big fat silly face. George is frightened and avoids indulging into an argument where he will be again insulted by his wife. Seeing the family in a state of confusion and disorganized and seeing the family members in a miserable state, the real Mrs. Pearson got very upset. While in the heated argument between George Pearson and the real Mrs. Fitzgerald, Doris enters left slowly, looking miserable. Seeing Doris, Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is actually the real Mrs. Pearson, calls her, "Hello, Doris dear." Though in a terrible state of mind, Doris greets her back, "Hello, Mrs. Fitzgerald." The real Mrs. Annie Pearson continues to speak and asks Doris about her plan with Charlie Spence. Doris, annoyed, "What is that to do with you?" Doris, annoyingly, "Why the neighbor is bothered about her plans with Charlie Spence." Of course, Doris is not aware that she is actually her mother, Mrs. Pearson. Seeing Doris misbehaving with the actual Mrs. Pearson, the real Mrs. Fitzgerald says, "Stop that," very firmly. She doesn't want Doris to speak in that manner to anyone and stops Doris from behaving that way. The real Mrs. Pearson replies that it's all right because she is used to all kind of rude behavior of the family members. But the real Mrs. Fitzgerald tells Mrs. Pearson that Doris' behavior is something that she is not going to tolerate in her house and instructs her to either reply to Mrs. Fitzgerald, the actual Mrs. Pearson, properly or else go upstairs again. Doris is shocked at her response and looks at her father astonished. Remember one thing, student. All the family members are still not aware that both the ladies, that is Mrs. Fitzgerald and Mrs. Pearson, have exchanged their personalities. So everybody was in a state of confusion of what is really happening in their own house, where their mother is behaving in such a strange manner. When Doris looked wondering at her father, George, having lost all hope about Mrs. Pearson, the actual Mrs. Fitzgerald tells Doris that even he cannot make the situation better. He has given up handling it and feels it has run out of his control. Doris feels sad and gives in to her mother's stern behavior and replies to Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is actually Mrs. Pearson, her mother, that she had cancelled the plans she had for the night with Charlie Spence. The real Mrs. Pearson gets concerned and asks her the reason for cancelling it. Doris, getting angry again, begins telling Mrs. Fitzgerald, the actual Mrs. Pearson, how her mother had been behaving all day. She says that her mother had been finding ways to make her feel bad about Charlie Spence, commenting about his appearance and intelligence. She told Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is actually her mother, that her mother has called Charlie Spence bucked and is half-witted. Hearing all this time, the real Mrs. Pearson says to real Mrs. Fitzgerald rather boldly, and she decided to take a stand against her. The real Mrs. Pearson speaks up. "Oh, you shouldn't have said that." But the real Mrs. Fitzgerald very bluntly tells the real Mrs. Pearson to stay out of her family's matter and manage her own. In the meantime, George is listening to the conversation between the two ladies and asks his wife that is she trying to angry the guest also by misbehaving? But Mrs. Pearson, the real Mrs. Fitzgerald, replies mockingly and reminded him that everyone is waiting for him in the club and tells Doris not to cry again. Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is actually Mrs. Pearson, as we know that she is actually changed personality, as we know that she has actually changed the personality because she wants her friend to set her family members right, but now she feels that everything is enough and she can't bear to see more. The real Mrs. Annie Pearson gets really disturbed and wants everyone to leave as she wants to talk in private with the real Mrs. Fitzgerald. She gives them assurance that she is the only one who can handle the situation, so it would be of their benefit only if they would give both some time alone. George is happy because somebody is going to help him because he knows he is helpless and can't do anything about the situation. Both George and Doris leave the scene, and the actual Mrs. Pearson moves towards a table and sits and beckons. Beckons means make a gesture with the hand to Mrs. Fitzgerald to do the same. Now let us see what happened when all the family members leave the house and what was the conversation between Mrs. Pearson and Mrs. Fitzgerald.